The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
All right, folks, good morning. If you haven't met me, I'm Angelina Jolie. Actually, I'm Todd Strickland. By now, you've all read the conference agenda. You've read the bios on our speakers. And you know we're into panel 2, and you've seen the complete text of what we're supposed to be doing. I'm really excited because we have an incredibly diverse panel representing 4 different institutions. We've got Marc Ozawa from the NATO Defense College, Dimitru Minzarari from the Baltic Defense College, and I hope that wasn't too much of an Italian pronunciation for a Romanian. Marta Kepe from RAND, and then we've got Howard Coombs from CIDP and the Royal Military College. And it's interesting picking up on the themes from panel 1 as we move into the second panel, because what we're really going to try to do with this panel is get after some of Claire's request to get after and reframe our understanding of conflict. And definitions, contrary to what some might think, actually do matter. But definitions are really about our understanding of a phenomenon. So I'm going to start with Clausewitz's definition of war as an act of violence intended to compel our opponent to fulfill our will. That's really the only comprehensive definition that exists, and it frames military thinking in particular on conflict. Now, Clausewitz also said that the character of war changes, the nature does not. And I'd submit to you that maybe Clausewitz was wrong, and that's almost anathema, and they'll kick me out of the Canadian Forces College for saying that. But if war is really changing and our conception needs to change, perhaps we need to go beyond the character of war changing and talk about the nature of war as well. So, going back to Dr. Martel's opening comments, which I think reinforces my premise that the nature might be changing as well as the character, war remains a fundamental aspect of our existence as humans, but it is morphing into something new. And that's something I think we need to debate, and this panel is well postured to do that. So the general skit that we're going to follow is, I'm going to sit down because you don't need to hear from me anymore. Marc will kick off and then pass the clicker on to Dimitru, followed by Marta, followed by Howard. Howard has promised he will not take 5 minutes to inhale, and we'll try and keep it to 10 to 12 minutes per speaker, after which we'll take any questions you have. And of course, being a prepared moderator, I've got my list of 10 questions, but they all really, to go back to Rachel's comment, they mimic Game of Thrones Season 8 in that they suck. So I'm asking you to save me, help me out with your questions. I'll come back up to the podium and moderate your questions as we go on. But Marc, I will turn the floor over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Todd. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me back to Kingston. This is my 3rd time taking part in the conference. Always a pleasure to be here, and have enjoyed the discussions that we've had in the past. I am a researcher and a lecturer at the NATO Defense College. I tend to focus on topics regarding NATO's eastern flank, which is sort of shorthand for Russia. And a lot of the publications and analyses that I do are focused on Russia, about Russian conceptions of war. And so, as you can see from the title, I hope it's a provocative title, which is Russia's Total Global Hybrid War. And what's interesting about this title, here I'm borrowing a term used oftentimes in Russian media to describe what the so-called collective West is doing to Russia and has been doing to Russia since the mid-2000s. The term hybrid war in Russian is not originally a Russian term. It's borrowed from Western discourses of what Russians would call international confrontation. I'll get a little bit more into that, but what I think is also interesting about the term total global hybrid war is that first there's a reference to Clausewitz. So if you're familiar with Russian military thinking, Clausewitz is also very pervasive. Before 2022 and the second invasion of Ukraine, the term hybrid war, гибридная война, was still very pervasive in Russian debates, but the term has evolved over the last year and a half. It became global hybrid war, and more recently, it's turned into total global hybrid war. And I think this illustrates the thinking and the evolution of intensity that is perceived in the confrontation from the Russian perspective. And I apologize ahead of time. I sent 2 presentations when I realized that my original talk would be going way beyond the allotted time, so I may be skipping over a few slides depending on which version I have here. So most of what I'm going to say is drawing from 2 publications. I'm just going to give you the highlights of these publications, but I invite you to go back and read them if I mention anything that is of interest. The first is the cover you see on the right-hand side. The title is War Changes Everything, Russia After Ukraine. This is an edited volume that we published at the NATO Defense College in February of this year. Fortunately, going back, I have read my chapter contribution more recently, and I think it still holds up, more or less. The other authors, if you're interested, are Tracy German, Polina Sinovitz, Yanis Bergens, and Marc Galeotti. I will also be making a few points from a forthcoming book, maybe not the best book in the world ever, but I think it's not bad. It's called Trust and European-Russian Energy Relations. Should be coming out next week, available on Amazon if any of you are interested. So the main point that I want to make about the Russian perspective and approach to hybrid warfare is that the war in Ukraine has not changed the approach in terms of the areas of hybrid aggression. However, the frequency, intensity, and the risk that Russia is willing to take in these operations has increased. So in response to the question of the conference, it has not changed, but it has also changed somewhat. So here you see a lovely image of the GRU headquarters in Moscow, where, according to Bellingcat, a lot of the hybrid covert operations have been directed out of this facility. These are a few terms that I think are useful in understanding the Russian perspective on hybrid warfare. Certainly in Russian military thinking and also in political debates. The first is borrowing from a Cold War term, active measures, which refers to, I would describe as information war operations and covert operations. The main point I want to make here is that this is nothing new. Sub-threshold aggression, non-kinetic aggression is nothing new in Russian military thinking. What is new is technology as an enabler to provide many more options for operations. As I mentioned earlier, I think a term that is useful for understanding Russian conceptions of hybrid warfare is the term confrontation, which is usually how Russians would describe what we would use in invoking activities of hybrid warfare. And I mentioned earlier already the evolution over the last year and a half from the terminology of hybrid war to global hybrid war to total global hybrid war, which I think is an interesting evolution. So this is a very busy graph, but the main point that I want to make here, it's a translation of a graph that was used in an article that was based on General Gerasimov's 2018 speech to the military academy when he talked about total confrontation. And what you see here is a seamless, I hate to use spectrum after listening to the earlier keynote about policy approaches in Canada. But what you see here is a spectrum of different types of confrontation, and this sort of seamless connection ranging from kinetic, conventional military operations to economic aggression, to cyber, and then what's often left out of the discussions here about Russian approaches to hybrid warfare is the cultural dimension. So here we're talking about, say, sports events, academia, think tanks, nodes of interaction that influence public opinion. And this is one that I'm going to skip over because that's would be far too much. To give you a flavor of the cases that we used in this edited volume, what we were doing here was to try and provide cases that illustrate the changing intensity and frequency of Russian hybrid aggression since 2022. The first one is the weaponization of energy, and I think many of you know that this is nothing new in terms of Russian hybrid aggression. The weaponization of energy, cutting off energy supplies, goes back to the 1990s. Many NATO member states in the East experienced this with greater frequency before, but what is new is Russia's willingness to use this weapon against Central and Western European countries, and to do so drastically. The next is the weaponization of commodities, and I think the clearest example of this is the grain blockade in the Black Sea. The third case is nuclear threats and information warfare. And here I would also include the seizing and control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear energy plant. And the last case, which there's been perhaps less analysis done on this point, is the weaponization of methane and the environment. And here, the Kakhovka Dam would be one example of that. Weaponization of methane here, I'm referring to certainly earlier in 2022 and then towards the summer of 2022, Russian natural gas facilities located on the border would very visibly flare the extra methane into the air so that it was visible from the other side of the borders to try and instill a sense of concern among European leaders. And I think out of all of these cases, what we are still living with and certainly not out of the woods is the weaponization of energy. And this is a map that gives you a color-coded sense of the level of energy dependence across Europe, here in terms of Russian natural gas. This graph has changed since 2022 for obvious reasons. But we, in some respects, we got lucky in 22 in Europe. I live in Italy, and 2022 was a mild winter across Europe. The EU and European countries were able to coordinate pretty well and put a lot of natural gas supply into storage. So we're coming into the next winter on pretty good footing, but we're starting to feel the inflationary effects, and also some industries are beginning to put pressure on policymakers about what to do regarding energy costs in the long term. So this is, I'm going to skip over these and just come down to one or two policy recommendations that we put forward. Since 2022, for obvious reasons, much attention has, within NATO, has been focused on conventional war. And I think that that's well warranted, but hybrid aggression from Russia is not going anywhere. It's becoming more frequent and more intense. And while conventional, the new force posture, attention on conventional military warfare is good for deterrence, the direct points of contact that NATO member states will have with Russia in this confrontation are going to be in the gray zone, and I'll refer to my colleague for the next presentation. So hybrid aggression is not going anywhere, and we should not lose sight of that. So thank you very much. Yes, that's fine.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Very excited to share with this esteemed audience my ideas on hybrid warfare. And to introduce a little bit myself, in addition, I think in a way I'm a Marc Ozawa of the Baltic Defense College, that I also focus on Russian foreign and security policy, and I also work, teach and lecture on war dynamics. However, if Marc has a kind of a Clausewitzian view on the warfare, I'm more of a Jomini follower, that I'm trying to also look into the mechanics, the microdynamics of the conflict, so that we can see whether there is a difference between them or not. So in this regard, I mean, I'm a sort of a self-proclaimed war theorist. What I intend to do in the next 10 plus minutes is basically to continue the debate on the utility of the definitions, and I think they're extremely important for policy purposes. As someone who has worked both in policy and academia, I think that academics often overlook the necessity to operationalize abstract concepts so that it make it easier for the policy makers to consider. I'd like to start basically with the fact that there is both a NATO and a EU hybrid war policy. So whether we like it or not, this is a concept. So consider it as a political or policy artifact, but then at the time, both in 2015 for NATO and 2016 for EU, I think that was a strategically justified move, at least for two reasons. So first of all is that it signaled to Russia the resolve of the West to respond to its coercive actions below the threshold of war, which to a large extent they were initiated because Russia hoped that the resistance is going to be kind of a weak, non-existent, and it is going to be able to get advantage in interstate competition. And second, I mean, we all understand that if there is not a policy in place, there is no money, and you cannot, generate both resources, build capabilities, procedures in order to do that. So having done that, those decisions being adopted, they were very useful. Now, that also creates a problem now down the line for the policy planners who have to basically put this into practice. So this is an example of EU definition, which basically defined hybrid war as a mix of many activities. So I mean, those of you who have done policy planning, you're looking at that and said, well, for economic coercion, we have the economies working on that. So it's kind of a difficult on the security side to think on how you kind of lump all together. And it's not very, in a way, effective and efficient. Therefore, there has been a response even from inside those international organizations. In a recent Small Wars and Insurgencies article, the authors that you have the reference here, they basically interviewed NATO officials and professionals, and they got the response that there is little or no operational value in the concept, having faced the problem of operationalizing it. So as an academic, what I see here, I see basically two problems. One is what the political scientist Sartori calls concept traveling, and in particular North American, they know hybrid warfare coming from the definition of Frank Hoffman, reflecting on the Israeli-Palestinian kind of a conflict, I think in 2006 or so. And the second problem is the so-called concept stretching, which is a vague conceptualization, and here is the difficulty for the policymakers to do. So, what is the solution then, right? We want practical solutions to this kind of issues. And that's an additional kind of element of the challenge that at the NATO summit in Warsaw in 2016, the alliance basically declared that a hybrid action against one or more allies can be used to trigger Article 5. However, again, as a policy planners, the first question to ask is, okay, what observable kind of actions on the ground that you see you can use to define that a hybrid action has taken place, and it's not just an element of a smaller operation and so on. And on the other side, NATO member states might use this lack of clarity to say, well, we don't believe this is an instance of hybrid war. We believe that might be a domestic issue problem, and therefore we don't think it's necessary to enact Article 5. So that's an extra challenge that we have in relation to this issue. Now, should we accept the statement that hybrid concept is useless, as Anna Rutunian, a Russian journalist and scholar that used to be a global fellow at the Kennan Institute? I'd like to argue that not. I'd like to argue that there is sense actually to look, to consider hybrid war as a separate interstate aggression technology or method, which has traits that are different from conventional war, and if we identify those traits, then we're able to design more targeted policy, allowing us to save resources and be more effective. So in order to show the difference, I have three scenarios here. You have one scenario, election interfering, and all three scenarios point out to instances when a foreign aggressor uses those kind of activities below the threshold of violent conflict or of war, and is able to reach the same political objective, right? And historically, wars have been used to either conquer territory or resources or to influence policy. If you look statistically, most of the wars had those goals. And you can achieve the same goals with alternatives to the conventional kinetic war. So that's one scenario, election interfering. That's a second scenario where elections in a NATO country, not necessarily obviously linked to Russia. I give the example of a nationalist and populist leader coming into power and criticizing the West for the lack of values and saying that we promote conservative values, and that comes from real examples in Europe, and driving as a policy either withdrawing from NATO or jeopardizing NATO collective decision making and so on. And I think this case is important because many analysts say that, hey, hybrid war can be used by Russia only to drive Russia-friendly nations or governments, but that can be done indirectly. You exploit basically anti-Western, anti-liberal governments that does not necessarily, they can be even inimic for Russia, but as long as they undermine, the unity, and I don't want to give example in NATO, but the audience here, I mean, you probably can come up with a couple of those examples. And the third one also reflects one of the recent cases, a country in Africa rich with important strategic resources that the West is using, had a coup d'etat, Russia connections, refusing to sell this to the West, having new tenders to distribute the contracts and so on. Now again, access to resources, right? So in the past, we used to fight wars to get access to new land or strategic resources. Here you have a different type of approach to reach the same goal. Now, come on. So the way I would like to basically invite you to take a different perspective at conventional war, basically looking at conventional war targeting different pillars of sovereignty, comparing to other types of interstate aggression. I use the word technology, but those are the same synonym to types. So my assumption is that I use a very basic, the minimalist definition of sovereignty, which is territory, policy/leadership, and population. So different type of interstate aggression, they focus mainly on one or two of them, and I suggest conventional focuses on, in particular, on territory, capturing territory, first of all, or bombing the territory to create costs. Then the next one is policy leadership. I use a proxy war as a, not as a tactic, but as a strategy. As another alternative of interstate aggression, and the main goal here is policy and territory. And finally, I claim that hybrid, in particular, targets first the population and in parallel leadership. Depending on the type of regime, one can be more effective than another. It can be either targeting the leadership through the population or directed leadership. And I would dare to challenge you that can happen actually across the regime. Remember the Austrian case, how Austrian businessmen and politicians that were caught trying to get Russian money to advance Russian agenda in their domestic politics. So that was an approach directly towards the policymakers, the decision makers. So I'll conduct the structural comparison using three basically variables or kind of a structural factors. One, using three criteria. One is coercion sequence, another one is coercion target, and the final one is coercion means. And that's kind of a very rough illustration to give you an understanding of the differences that I'd like to present to you. That you have in conventional war, which is, in its essence, is a mutual attrition of military resources or will. And it uses mostly of the coercion means, this is kinetic, with some information. It targets, as I claim, if you break it down to the essence, you focus on territory by destroying the military. When you acquire control of the territory, you replace the leadership and you acquire control of the population. So in a way, this is the coercion sequence that I was pointing out to. And that's an example of the attrition dynamic in a coercive war, where you have, the degradation of resources across time. For, in this case, you have two peer competitors. Now, similarly, we look at the proxy war, which basically it's outsourcing of combat activities to a local group that was either exploited, internally, or it was inserted and presented as a domestic actor. So you see that the kinetic is still dominant as means of aggression. There is more of information, but the target is leadership to a large extent as a coercion sequence. Now, also in parallel, you have a disparity in resources, but it's similar. The dynamic of attrition is quite similar. You have resources and will being degraded over time in a competitive fashion. And finally, looking at the hybrid war, which I claim that population is the main kind of a coercion target. The majority of the means are information. Kinetic is just a little bit, and usually it is either to protect the new status quo or to consolidate the gains. And we have seen that in case of Crimea, at the beginning of the Donbas proxy aggression that Russia started, where they would take over the administrations and then bring armed people to kind of claim local militia to control the gains that they had. And the population, the attrition dynamic in a way, because it is population, it's very similar actually to an epidemic dynamic where initially, a few people gets affected, then there is a spike in infection, right? And here you can use conversion instead. And there is less people is being converted. But in a way, this is how the audience is being convinced to take on or accept a different idea or an explanation. Is a very similar dynamic. If you talk with the people conducting this research, the data would show that. So basically, as I said, I would argue that the difference between that we should, when we challenge the thing that hybrid has always been there, I think we should have to make differences. Those means being used as an assistant function for conventional war or other type of kinetic engagements, or if it's used as a separate strategy. And I'll go back to, I think Marc has kind of provided a good foundation talking about the way Russians view war as not just, an engagement with a clear beginning and end. The Russians, they view the conflict with the war, with the West as a continuous endeavor. And that goes back to the Soviet Union revolutionary wars. We're using the Comintern and so on to influence the workers and the masses to affect the policy making. Now, then they did not have access to technology, and I think this has been a kind of a breaking point that due to the access to technology, today a country that understands how to use that, it is able to reach to an extremely large number of the population in another country's territory directly, without intermediaries of agents of influence that they used in the past. That's one thing. Secondly, it almost allowed them to act as a domestic actor and even participate in elections through local proxies that they cultivate, and that happens a lot in Eastern Europe, for instance. Pointing out to a quote from General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, Marc already introduced kind of the ideas he had, but he emphasizes how the population conflict potential can be used in a interstate conflict and help the military achieve their objective without or with less kinetic force. So here I have those interested. Basically, looking at the strategic level, how switching between different operational domains of war is a cost-driven choice that Russia using interstate conflict through the operational domains of war is a strategic choice because it's more cost-efficient given the ability to reach objectives. Now, I know this is a terrible slide. However, this is the best illustration of the Russian thinking of the so-called hybrid warfare, and it comes from an interview with in New York Times with Putin's press secretary, Peskov. And I love that kind of element of the interview because as a political scientist, I see that a signaling device about how the Russian political elite think, about this type of interstate aggression, where they talk about Peskov says, the new reality creates a perfect opportunity for mass disturbances or for initiating mass support or mass disapproval. So I think this is really powerful and reflects a lot how elites think about that. And if elites in a totalitarian or authoritarian regime have a view on how to, to conduct policy, then this is going to be pushed down the line on the, on the ministries, defense, security, and so on, to implement it this way. So finally, my conclusions is that hybrid, what EU and NATO has labeled as hybrid war, operates happens in a different operational domain of war, which is the informational space, and it has not been formally codified by NATO countries. They edit cyber as a synthetic operational domain of war to the physical ones that we had before. But information space is ignored for objective reasons, but still is ignored. Now, it uses a different coercion sequence, target, and means, which generally basically says, okay, so through less violence and through different means, under particular conditions, similar political goals can be achieved. So it's a good alternative to kinetic ways of launching war through use of military force. And what is important that in Russia, the military, the Ministry of Defense, the military guys actually are planning and operating that. And Marc pointed to the Military Intelligence Directorate, the GRU in Moscow, being implicated or conducting this very frequently. So I already pointed out to the fact of how global communication changed and how it's so different from the past. And this is basically the effect of scale, right? Effect of scale matters a lot. It is, you can have access to 5% of the worker class through some agents of influence and have one effect. But if you have effect to 30% of the population, right? I mean, research has been conducted. If 25% of the population believes something, then that can be through the social media. You can actually make another significant segment of the population accepted this. So the idea proliferates and gets accepted through a larger mass of the people. Now, it is based on a borderless operational domain. And aggressor gets full access to state political process with direct impact on the population. Now, you have physical borders, so you see when the aggressor crosses the border in traditional conventional war. Here, informational space that doesn't have a national border, with the exceptions. You have China and Russia, who actually are some of the the users of this type of interstate aggression, and actually they separated themselves. The informational space is being controlled from the external interference. You have the Great Wall of China, sort of, and you have Russians trying to achieve the sovereignty of the informational space. Based on that, one of my claims is an easier way to identify, at least the essence, what it is called hybrid warfare, and I think it's a very problematic concept, is to talk about a population-centric war. So I'll stop here, and thank you for your attention.
All right, I'll just pass it along. I guess it's my turn now. Hello, everyone. I'm Marta Kepe. I'm a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation. Before that, I also teach at the Foreign Service Institute, and before that I used to work for the Latvian Ministry of Defense on regional defense cooperation and defense sector reform in NATO, PFP countries. Before I say anything, I have to say that nothing that I say today represents the views of the RAND Corporation or any of our sponsors. Only my failed opinions, I guess. So I will briefly talk about three topics. One is some of the drivers of change that we see in gray zone methods and warfare methods. Two is Russia and Russian application of measures short of war gray zone approaches. So I think the first two speakers already prepared the ground for me here really well. And I will finish up with some of the ways how to prepare, how to mitigate these types of threats. And I'll be happy to continue the discussion about how to go about preparation and resilience building after the presentations too. So first, I guess this works better. So first, political, economic, and subversive activity overall is a consistent element of warfare. And we can talk about multiple examples of what we call gray zone or hybrid activities, not only from the last century, but throughout the history of warfare. So overall, it's not really nothing new. But why is it that we are talking more about gray zone conflict these days, more than even several years ago? Well, there are several reasons for that, and I wanted to highlight some of them. One explanation is, and that is sort of also self-critical because it does exist also in the analytical community, is that overall we have a relatively short memory about our own experiences and experiences of our allies and partners and other countries and actors in the world. we have a short attention span. So following the end of the Cold War, the West sought to improve relations with Russia, for example. It was suddenly a completely different world, right? President Clinton also attempted this constructive engagement with Russia and normalized U.S.-China, and then normalized U.S.-China trade relations. So there was this sort of normalization of U.S. relations with Russia and China, and also normalization of the West's relations with these countries. But that was only a few years after the Soviet active measures were actually targeting the U.S. political system. Even during the announcement, after the announcement of Glasnost and Perestroika, Russian, or at that time Soviet active measures against the U.S. political environment actually increased and became more frequent because of this opening of relations. Later on, after the collapse of the Cold War, Russia had several, milk product, meat, and other product sort of wars or clashes with a number of countries, very often with the Baltic states, Poland, and other neighboring countries with which they had a lot of trade relations. And that was with the purpose, with the aim to, either retaliate or to impact their domestic or foreign policy decisions, under the pretext, very often, the pretext of health concerns, for example. So Russia, at one point, Russia blocked Georgian wine and mineral water imports. In 2009, Russia blocked the import of milk and milk products from Belarus after Lukashenko expressed critique of Russian leadership. And then later on, in 2014, Russia retaliated to various European countries, including Italy, Greece, Bulgaria, but also to Japan, following the waves of EU and international sanctions. It also blocked the import of farm and wild animals from a number of countries under the pretext of the blue tongue or BT disease. But really, we can track the links with political decisions at the time. So another reason is the fact that new technology has created new ways how adversaries may adapt their gray zone measures today and also in future. So we really have to mention technology, and it has been mentioned today already. Cyber-based operations have been the most prominent new tool of gray zone operations so far, and technology will continue to be the new frontier in gray zone operations. New tools, of course, include AI. Increased adoption of AI and machine learning techniques tools in the civilian but also in the military spheres may offer us many, many benefits. But it will also create many vulnerabilities that may be exploited by our adversaries. They may carry out so-called AI or adversarial attacks. They would try to manipulate the way AI learns, weaponize data, and manipulate the sort of inherent limitations in the underlying AI algorithms. So here, unfortunately, despite the hopes that we have for AI, there are also problems because relatively small but very strategically chosen manipulations to input data either physically or digitally may lead to large-scale output problems. And the third reason that I wanted to mention, and there are many others, these are only three, is the third reason is related to the economy of force. Asymmetric approaches may offer economy of force and effort. They may be used to challenge a more conventionally, economically superior adversary. And they may be used to undermine these actors from within, undermine their democracies, economic power, societal cohesion, and influence in the world. So they are a tool that may be very, financially attractive. So how about Russia? We already heard from the previous two speakers really interesting points about Russia, and here's my 2 cents here. So Russian traditions of active measures is sort of one of the terminologies that we use as already presented by Marc. The traditions of active measures really go back not only to the Soviet Union, but even to the Russian Empire. The Tsarist police, or Okhrana, was involved in domestic operations, but they also carried out information operations and manipulation and covert operations elsewhere in the world. They also used agents of influence abroad. So, for example, some of the operations that have been documented in different papers that have been written are their operations in France. So France had Russian emigre populations, and Okhrana conducted penetrations of immigrant dissident organizations in France. And there's also a very interesting instance where they published a critique of a travelogue of Russia that was written by a French writer, where they didn't really like how Russia was portrayed in the travelogue. Later on, the KGB first institutionalized disinformation by creating a dedicated office for active intelligence operations in 1923. Later on, this is more going to today, because you may say, well, so what, that's history. But more recently, Russia institutionalized or put in, sort of embraced these approaches in their defense and security strategies, such as the National Security Strategy and the Information Security Doctrine, which embrace active measures and information warfare as a strategic priority in peacetime, and at least theoretically, also as a proactive yet defensive measure. So, during the Cold War, the political situation in the target country was very often the prime objective of Soviet active measures, especially in its main adversary, the United States. And the majority of their operations really sought to exploit the weaknesses, the mistakes, the shortcomings of the domestic and foreign policies of the target country. They were really quick to realize how different problems that exist in their target countries, either domestically or in terms of their relations with other countries, such as racial inequality, diseases, or even novel diseases, political frictions between Europe and the United States, or may be used to undermine these countries internally, but also damage their external image, undermine cooperation, and promote the Soviet ideology at the time. So at that time, they often used print media, front and proxy organizations, different sort of friendship societies to exploit what really were genuine concerns and divisions in different countries. That also includes actually civil rights and nuclear weapon questions. For example, the Soviets exploited genuine concerns about the AIDS epidemic, and they mounted a long-term disinformation campaign that AIDS had been developed by the US government. And that is a long-standing disinformation campaign that actually still has, for a long time, still had some residue in societies, both in the United States, but also in other parts of the world. So Russia today has revived Soviet-era practices, but they have really adapted these practices to the changed environment, to the more open, to the more networked environment that we have, to the fact that we have much more of the traveling is much easier. There are a lot of information technologies that link the world much better. And they have tailored the means and methods that they've used to each target. So it has molded active measures into a tool of state power and also a weapon of war, which is exercised through a number of different organizations: government organizations, intelligence agencies, state and privately owned enterprises, traditional and social media, but also different groups of people that are more or less loosely affiliated with Russia. So compared to the Soviet Union, Russia's methods have been more subtle, less militaristic until maybe recently. And really, the developments in information technology have really facilitated an explosion in how it uses this as an amplifier. With time, their active measures have also become more aggressive. And they have sought really to create a lot of not necessarily to convince you about certain opinions, but really create confusion, obfuscation, create confusion in the information environment. So how about the future? What can we expect from my point of view, at least? So with the reduction of Russian conventional power, because it's using up a lot of its conventional forces in the war with Ukraine, in my opinion, we could expect Russia to lean more on its gray zone capabilities and methods. As I said, these methods may be more affordable means of influence seeking, maybe also more subtle means of influence seeking. And it can seek out not only its body of different services, private military companies, but also these sometimes very loosely affiliated groups that exist across the world. So the other thing is that so far we really see this focus on gray zone methods and hybrid warfare when it comes to the information technology and information space. But more recent incidents also show that there is a trend, and I think that trend is going to continue. The trend of the issue of vulnerability of infrastructure, vital infrastructure, energy infrastructure, undersea lines of communication, energy cables, pipelines, but also other types of infrastructure that we have. Some examples, some more recent examples from the north of Europe is the fact that Norway's undersea sensors collecting data on passing submarines were knocked out and cables were cut. There are also reports of fishing vessels observing oil and wind turbines. I already mentioned that information environment is changing, the proliferation of AI tools and the fact that they can be used to manipulate audio and video, so we can expect those types of threats and those types of challenges to enter our world too. So how about responding to these challenges, gray zone measures? So a part of my analytical work is indeed looking at threats, but also looking at how can we prepare, respond, how can we prepare our societies, how civilian society, but also the military sector, to address or prepare for these challenges. So the big answer really here is it is about building resilience, both in our military and in our civilian societies, military and civilian infrastructure, governance systems, organizations. I was really heartened, was really happy to hear during the previous panel, and also Senator Patterson talked about whole of government activities and also civil defense. I would go one step further. I think that the approach really, the solution probably really lies in the whole of societal approaches to defense. That is not something new. That is something that really see a lot of developments in the Baltic states, in the Nordic countries that have been either readapting what they had, let's say, either during the Cold War or in the case of the Baltics or some other countries in the very, very early 1990s. So, or creating these sort of approaches how to involve all of their society in national defense, and not only when we talk about military intervention in their countries, but also in terms of boosting their abilities to respond to any kind of civil defense emergency, whether it's be floods, snowstorms, or anything else. So I'll be happy to talk more about it, but I really believe in the sort of preventive measures, boosting our frameworks, networks, our procedures, how we are able to mobilize civil emergency actors to support, to take on certain duties when it is a military emergency, because civil emergency actors, as we see from the war in Ukraine, have a massive role also when a war is going on. There are civilians need to be protected, they need to be evacuated, etc. But also the other way around, the military forces can also assist in a civilian emergency. And there are many different models that exist across the world in terms of how it can be done and how it can be done in a way that works for all players. So I'll stop here, but I'll be happy to continue discussion later. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Howard Coombs. I have the privilege of being the Deputy Director for the Center for International Defense Policy and Defense Policy. And I'm also privileged to teach at RMC, where I tell people I teach for food. So that's how I explain what I do. Mental models are important because they in large part determine how we perceive the world, and in the context of this panel, as you've already heard, the security environment. Now I'm going to wait till my esteemed colleague Dr. Martin's lips stop moving, because that's how I'll judge my slides. Critical to gaining understanding of conflict is knowing how Canada and our allies perceive it. One can argue that in the West, since the Napoleonic period, conflict has been viewed as a linear progression, moving from activities that do not involve violence to activities that require the use of that instrument. One can see from this slide how Canada and others generally viewed the operations of the period immediately after the Cold War. However, in recent years, these notions have not been able to adequately deal with the challenges posed by the global security environment. This dilemma has in turn created a search for a new comprehension of warfare. Now, before I start in the next few slides, I would also like to acknowledge that the research I'm pulling together was originally conducted by now retired Brigadier-General Dave Anderson, who will be presenting tomorrow. The work of his and his team is exceptional, and I'll highlight it throughout the presentation. One conceptual tool that has arisen to deal with these emergent dangers is the idea of gray zone conflict. As depicted in the slide, the gray zone, like most of an iceberg, is underwater and not visible from the surface. While lacking clarity, most definitions of gray zone conflict share three main principles. First, gray zone activities are designed to avoid creating a response involving military force. Second, these adversarial actions are opaque, creating a great deal of confusion in recognizing and interpreting what transpired. Last, the use of technology is maximized to target specific audiences and create a maximum effect. Integrating the gray zone into our broader conceptual framework of conflict permits consideration of a spectrum of related activities that will not involve military force. Despite giving a broader approach to understanding the character of war, incorporating the gray zone into our mental model approach is also lacking. It requires further refinement to be useful as a strategic tool. From all of this, it is evident that a differing conceptualization of conflict is required. This new perspective should enable the formation of nuanced strategies that will effectively utilize ends, ways, and means to address these 21st century dilemmas. Ongoing work in the United States and Canada may provide perspectives upon re-envisioning or revisioning the evolving character of war, starting with the idea of the competition continuum. The 2018 United States Joint Concept for Integrated Campaigning suggests a competition continuum to reimagine the fashion in which the challenges of the international security environment are interpreted and resolved, using the foundation of multi-domain battle or ideas of fighting within and across domains, including air, land, sea, space, cyberspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, as well as the cognitive element of human perception. Enabled by technology, the competition continuum has three states of interactions of international relations, which can be seen on this slide. Armed conflict, through competition below armed conflict, to cooperation. These three major elements can be divided into subsections providing activity or operational guidance, which match strategic ways and means. And within these activities are opportunities to work with partners to deal with these international challenges and achieve strategic objectives or ends using the widest variety of instruments. Further Canadian development in the form of the Pan-Domain Force Employment Concept, or PFEC, builds on these ideas underpinning the competition continuum to give a holistic strategic tool which assists in comprehending the 21st century security setting. The Canadian Pan-Domain Force Employment Concept presents a somewhat more nuanced model to describe and comprehend competitive actions. It's designed to include a greater range of competition between states, partners, and challengers than the competition continuum. Underpinning the matrix of competition, as shown in this slide, is an assumption that all cross-domain activities will be integrated with allies and regional partners and includes military and non-military activity. Unlike the American framework, which is more focused on enabling the United States joint force, the Canadian model emphasizes an integrated civil-military force employment structure, including, if necessary, multiple state and non-state members. Despite that difference, the Canadian Pan-Domain Force Employment Concept, like the United States Joint Concept for Integrated Campaigning, is also reliant on technology to create adaptive, comprehensive responses that will effectively and quickly respond to security challenges. Plus, both aim at generating a rapid decide-act cycle that will dislocate adversaries. The slide itself depicts different states of conflict running from regular, irregular, and gray zone conflict to give you an idea of the holistic perspective of the continuum. It ranges from, on its two axes, it ranges from persuasive to coercive activities, those not involving violence to involving violence, and on the horizontal axis, covert or no state involvement to overt state involvement. The utility of this matrix is further enhanced by the addition of a third axis. I had to do that to all of you this time in the morning. A third axis that has time. So if we see here in the colors that you see on the slide, again, we have the three states of warfare from conventional, limited, and gray zone conflict on the left-hand side as you look at it. But on the right-hand side, the groupings by color are the actions of adversarial actors, our opponents. When viewed along those three axes, the matrix of competition provides a useful model to better understand the full range of non-linear competitive interactions between us and the adversaries. The matrix of competition serves to support strategic thought by linking the array of activities in cooperation, competition, and armed conflict into a single model. It provides a strategic conceptualization of conflict with a method that is free from reductionist understanding or perspective of conflict as a sliding scale of violent activities. One could argue that in place of the spectrum of conflict, the matrix of competition can guide military actions as well as the application of all instruments of national power through giving a better understanding of scope, scale, and intensity of adversary actions over time. Now, additionally, for my colleagues here from the Canadian Forces College and other staff colleges, for those familiar with design theory or systems perspectives, the nature of this model may allow a degree of prediction concerning opponents' intent and possible activities by providing for visualization of clusters of adversarial activities, which is actually very useful for wargaming and strategic planning. So a few deductions and inferences that I've taken from all this, and I think you can pull them from the discussions we've already had with this panel, is that strategic clarity is required in understanding the evolving character of war and how the expression of conflict has changed. A degree of conceptual confusion exists through imprecise terminology and constructs. This inhibits the creation of integrated strategy. Adopting more nuanced models of war, such as the competition matrix, may allow for better strategic dialogue and informed comprehension of conflict. Next, narrative. The need for a well-constructed strategic narrative is fundamental. It serves several purposes, from aligning one's own forces through the creation of common understanding and shared purpose, to convincing opponents and others of one's policy goals or ends. And as Marta pointed out, it also increases societal resilience. It aids in that effort. Last, strategic partnering with other nations, international organizations, and civilian agencies, to name a few, will allow for integrated activities that will address the ways and means of a comprehensive approach to preempt, disrupt, or neutralize the behaviors of oppositional actors. Now, I couldn't resist if I didn't close off with my most quoted, least read military theorist, Karl von Clausewitz. And it actually is the quote that Brigadier-General Strickland opened us with. And I would think that as we travel through the next couple of days, we keep in mind that war's nature is violent, interactive between opposing wills, and driven by politics. Its character is constantly changing. And the concepts and definitions we use to understand war are not neutral. They guide our interpretations and responses to conflict. As warfare evolves and becomes increasingly complex, it is essential to critically examine and adapt our conceptual frameworks to ensure they remain relevant and reflect the full spectrum of contemporary conflicts. In today's world, a nuanced understanding of war is crucial for effective conflict prevention, management, and resolution. Reconceptualizing and defining a strategic understanding of war as competition, I believe, will allow for a more fulsome approach to the strategic challenges of the 21st century. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to your observations.
So I've been asked not to direct any questions to Rachel because she had the last panel, and so she's not going to carry on. But what questions do you have for the panelists? And we'll get a couple of mics walked around. Sir, at the back.
Yes, I'm Mike Collins. I'm a token American from Nashville, Tennessee, coming up today. I have a question specifically for you, Marta. You did a good job of pointing out some concrete examples of a hybrid war that had just been constant with Russia vis-a-vis the United States, particularly during the Clinton administration and others. There's been a recent book by Calder Walt and Spies, The Epic Intelligence War. And in that book, he makes a very strong case that much of the activity that's taking place at the hybrid area is part of an internal competition within Russia itself, that the GRU and others are acting at times independently without authorization, that this product of their work is more or less political capital. And so my question is, how much of that do we really believe is directed by state policy? How much of that is going about in almost a mafia type of illegal activity? Thank you.
Do we do a collection of questions, or? Okay.
Yeah, we'll just do one at a time.
Okay.
So.
Great question, I think. I'm afraid I'm not privy to the discussions within the Kremlin walls about the reality of the life there, or the FSB or GRU. Overall, there seems to be a sort of consensus, but please, if my colleagues want to contradict me, I'll be happy to hear your opinions. That so oftentimes, indeed, the GRU or an FSB or other sort of actors and their operations are not necessarily coordinated, right? In fact, sometimes they have, sort of crossed fire, so to speak, in some ways and in some regions. So there's definitely the problem of coordination and their reality of coordination. But overall, I mean, I think it's pretty clear of the sort of what kind of policies and what is the overall objectives and aims of Russian actors when they work in other countries. And I'm not just talking about the United States or Europe, I'm also talking about Africa and other regions, and Latin America and other places in the world, right? So that's sort of where my answer, I think, and there's the coordination aspect is definitely something that I think we've seen and that has been documented quite a bit. But maybe my colleagues here have something to say.
I'm just going to, echo your assessment. I wish I were a fly in the walls of the Kremlin sometimes to understand the dynamics. But I think that there are some cases where it's clear that there was either no coordination among the different ministries or some sort of tacit cooperation with non-state actors for cyber attacks, for amplifying Russian narratives in the information space. So I think that it's a mix of both. I think in some cases I would be surprised if it were not directly state sanctioned, especially I'm thinking of covert operations, assassinations, that sort of thing. But for some of the activities in the information space, cyber attacks, I think that it's both. Yeah.
I'd like to show a little bit less analytic humility than my colleagues and push the argument slightly further. So based on some indicators that we see from the Kremlin, my reading is there is a strategic kind of objective that the Kremlin gives to its intelligence agencies, and they run the operation, and they compete among each other, in terms of who better would achieve this objective. But this is not only specific to Russia, because in the West, there is need to know. Agencies don't really share information about operations unless they clash on the ground. So this problem exists. I think in Russia is the case that there is an aggressive competition between the agencies, basically looking to get access to more resources. And what has been, the signals that I refer to in the presidential administration, there are ex-FSB or SVR, but usually FSB guys that run intelligence operations basically from the presidential administration, and there has been journalistic investigations based on leaked documents how they targeted political leaders across the post-Soviet space, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, Baltic, some of the Baltic states, and so on, how they use or try to influence local political leaders, parties, and so on. But they cannot do that by themselves because they don't have the boots on the ground, so they would use those intelligence agencies to support. So that's maybe a little bit more fine-grained picture, although it's also a more speculative in slightly.
Okay. On the right.
Madeleine Mayette. Could you please, Dr. Coombs, bring back your slides about the 3D? It's an excellent one.
Oh, thank you. But I can't really take credit for it. It is Dave Anderson's slide. He allowed me to crib it from him for this presentation. Let's see if I can do this. Nope. Oh.
Okay, you just passed it.
Just passed it.
Okay, my question is for both Dr. Coombs and Dr. Minzarari. My question is direct. BRICS and the involvement of the 7 other countries that are going to be part of the economic development of BRICS. Would you consider that in that slide part of the gray zone, or did you don't consider BRICS part of the gray zone?
Well, I would, based on the way I look at it, I would suggest that it would depend on intent and purpose. So the activities can be benign. It just, they may have an intended or unintended consequences, but in the end of the day, it's about intent and purpose. So if the activities they were doing could be charted on a slide like this, indeed, and then, but it might take a while to figure out effect, particularly when we talk about gray zone activities. So I guess it's a non-answer to your question. Yes, it is useful for depicting activities, but we won't know until the activities manifest in effect what their impact will be on us, for example.
Well, I have a slightly different conceptualization of hybrid war, and basically I think that gray zone and hybrid war, they, in a way, are synonymous, but North Americans use gray zone because they kind of don't like hybrid war, and Europeans use hybrid war. So kind of that very, kind of a broad simplification. In terms of BRICS, I don't think that's a hybrid war activity or, conducted in the context of the, or in the gray zone. To me, that looks as a typical diplomatic mobilization where different countries try to get supporters across the globe to, to kind of to help the agenda, and you build competing institutions where you try to support different international system rules, right, or undermine the other. So the Russians and the Chinese, they're trying to use BRICS to provide an alternative framework of conducting interstate relations, and of course they are weak now, and they have been trying. I mean, Russians pointed to BRICS many times to claim that the international system is multilateral. It's not anymore, unilateral, run by the West and so on. So that's a part of their kind of the tug over the rules of the game in their international system. So I think that's a kind of a diplomatic play rather than conducting activities, on a coercive basis in the gray zone.
Hi, Bob Leving, Strategic Reconnaissance. You've all alluded to the fact that this form of warfare, if you like, is more economical than kinetic total engagement, but Russia is a country which has 4 times the population of Canada and an economy that's smaller, and it's presently undergoing tremendous burden from sanctions. How long can they sustain this with the confrontation they're presently engaged with without either resorting to some dramatic alteration to try to save themselves or just collapse? Question 1. Question 2, who else do you see out in the world embracing this strategy now? Canada is starting to see nibbling around the edges on our sovereignty from other countries, but who else is out there playing this game? Thanks.
Well, I'll provide a few observations on your second question. I'll allow those who, I don't really spend as much time on Russian activities, so I'm really not my research area, and I wouldn't want to. I do make up stuff for the undergraduates, but I wouldn't want to do it for you. So I would say we're seeing examples of gray zone hybrid warfare activities occurring throughout the Indo-Pacific right now, for example, and I do believe that we see them in other parts of the world, such as even in some of the war-torn states in the Congo from neighbors. So I think it is prevalent, but the issue is actually recognizing it as to what is actually happening. Is it a campaign? Are these isolated incidents? Why are they happening? And unfortunately, because we don't really look at this, I think this goes back to my original argument. Because we don't conceptualize conflict like this on a routine basis, we don't know what's happening all the time. We only know something's happened after it's happened. And then it's too late. It's in our rearview mirror. So those are my observations on question 2. I'll defer to the other panelists.
I can offer some observations on the first and a little bit on the second one, maybe. So first about economics. Is gray zone only about economics? No, it's not. And more often than not, the economic part is not really the main Russian means of influence. It has been throughout, if you look like at the last 30 years, Russia has used very often these sort of like trade blocking means of influence, for example, with the countries that trades with Russia a lot. Now, since 2022, and even 2020, it has changed, right? things have changed, as you noticed, as you mentioned, with the sanctions and everything. So for Russia, for example, if you really look at, energy supply to European countries has been one sort of strong means of influence seeking, maybe to add to the many terms we've been using today. But in Africa, they have actually been using a lot of military tools, military trade, training, etc., as a means of ensuring and maintaining the influence with different actors. Also diplomatic means of influence. Information and economic, not that much, although over the years they have tried to exploit or explore sort of cooperation on, let's say, nuclear energy. Some of the African countries have had nuclear energy aspirations, so they really wanted to, to put their foot in there because they do have the experience of building nuclear power plants. On the other hand, China is actually using a lot of economic means across the world, really, also in Europe. But it's also using informational means of influence. And I mentioned Africa because I've done work on it. The amount and the ways how China is seeking informational presence and means of influence across the African countries is really interesting. Through presence, to putting their own media companies there, through media company acquisitions, but also through acquisitions of media and informational related infrastructure. So that's a very sort of big part in certain places. So yeah, in terms of who else, I mentioned China, and China actually, I'm not a China expert, there may be China experts here in the room. They do also conceptualize approaches like that. I know that they have the 3 warfare approach, where it's psychological, legal, and I think informational types of influence warfare. But they're also at other, compared to them, I'd say other actors are also using different methods of economic and diplomatic influence, and even military sort of cooperation. It's not necessarily a gray zone activity, right? It can just be cooperation. So let's say who else could use these methods in terms of seeking sort of maybe trying to use them in a malign kind of way. I mean, Iran has attempted certain activities here and there. I think some Latin American countries have sort of tried, not too much, but there's sort of somewhere going on. So there are other actors, but really compared to Russia and China, these are really the main actors that have been really developing on their influence across the world.
So I also agree that economic activities, I mean, we probably would be inaccurate to say that it's based, a hybrid warfare, or the conflict in the gray zone is based on economic activities. I see more of that as a means, because it allows to target, based on the concept I provided, it allows to target both the population by affecting their needs or the political leadership. So even though Russia is not an economic power, I think what Russia has, I mean, some call it an energy superpower, but the way I see it is that there is this asymmetric dependence between Russia and, in particular case, Europe, in terms of energy needs. So I think a few years ago, the European Council of Foreign Relations very well explained it, saying that, hey, look, if we stop saying IKEA stuff to Russia, it's not going to affect them very much. But since some of the countries are 70% energy dependent on Russia, if Russia stopped to sell this to us, it's going to hurt it until we kind of look for alternative for trade. And I mean, before coming to Baltic Defense College, I was for 2 years a Russia analyst with the German Institute for International Security, working kind of consulting governmental agencies, the Chancellery. And with the Germans, we're talking with the German counterparts, and they were saying, look, Soviet Union, even during the Cold War, did not stop energy supplies, to the West. So we don't believe that Russia or Putin is so stupid to do that because we're their cash cow, right? They do depend on us on the money. However, they were wrong, and they were forced and pushed, after the Russian invasion against Ukraine, to basically cut this dependence, where you have countries now going from 70% dependence to 10, and going down, looking for alternatives. So I think it has been a very effective pressure tool. Then I think also Russia and China mostly use, but why? They have the capabilities to generate what I called the scale of impact. You need capabilities. You need also knowledge, and you need to amass those capabilities through procedures. And you have those trolls factories in Russia. You have different oligarchs funding millions and billions into both media coverage, but also those influence operations. And not any country can do that. Russia and China. I think Russia is the most kind of able to, or skilled at that, and China comes second. That would be my understanding.
Marc, did you have anything?
Yeah, just a couple points to add to what has already been said. I suspect that Russia can sustain the current level of warfare in Ukraine and maintain its basic economic activity, not indefinitely, but at least in the near to medium term, the next 2 to 5 years. Russia experienced some inflation in 2022, but there are signs that they're getting that under control. The reason that sanctions in 2022 have had unintended consequences is because they had side effects on Russian energy prices, on global energy prices. So because of sanctions in 2022, although Russia exported less oil and gas to Europe, it actually made more money because of the inflated prices. So with every sanctions package that the EU is designing, they're trying to address these inconsistencies. Another reason why I think Russia will be able to weather the sanctions, at least in the near term, is because ever since 2014, they have tried to develop alternatives and safeguards to their dependency on Europe as a market. So investing very heavily in LNG so that they can sell globally rather than just be confined to Europe. And then China and India. So in 2014, also in response to the European reaction to Crimea, they finally negotiated long-term contracts with China for oil and gas exports. And they had been negotiating this with China since the early 2000s, couldn't agree on a price until 2014 because they were motivated to do so. And I think the real question about how Russia will be able to sustain is more on military industrial production. So will they be able to either procure and produce domestically the artillery that they need, or be able to find it from other sources like North Korea and Iran? And we had an interesting discussion we have different views about how long Russia can maintain that production, but I think that's the more interesting question about Russia being able to sustain this.
So, folks, unfortunately, we have to call a line here, being that we only have an hour for lunch, and I know there was one more question, so I'd encourage you to hit the panelists over lunch. They won't talk with their mouths full. I do want to offer one perspective, though. We talked a lot about China and Russia. If we were sitting in Berlin or Moscow right now, and you asked who the biggest purveyor of hybrid warfare was, it would probably be NATO in the West. Because if we turn the lens on ourselves, we are doing all these things in perhaps an uncoordinated fashion, but I would argue that hybrid warfare is a great venue for mission command where you can give an intent, and then that competition among agencies comes in, and there's all kinds of effects. So if you would join me in, one last point. As I was preparing for this, this panel hosting duty, which is incredibly onerous, I got to tell you, the Canadian Army Journal and the NATO Association of Canada released on Saturday their latest edition, digital only, which is available at canada.ca if you type in Canadian Army Journal Hybrid Warfare. Aditi's work has produced a new volume, which is excellent in addressing a lot of what we've talked about. But with that being said, please join me in thanking our panelists for their conversations. You want to? Yeah.